You're right, Florida State pulled it off. Once again, best recruiting class in the ACC. Not sure that's really a big shock. By rivals, they had the #2 class in the country as of the time that this is being recorded. And so I think it just continues the excellent work that Jimbo Fisher is doing down there in Tallahassee, pulling in talented kids on top of talented kids, and it seems like that whole dynasty that they've been building over the last few years really isn't going anywhere in the near future. I think maybe one of the more impressive efforts, like you said, was Clemson, who on Rivals is currently listed at #5. For them, they've traditionally under Dabo Swinney recruited fairly well, not quite top 5 level though, and so for him to pull together this class was pretty impressive. I know today, Rashawn Gary, top prospect in the country, defensive tackle. A lot of people had thought he was going to Michigan, but there was kind of becoming this thought that he may end up at Clemson. So the fact that they were even in that discussion this late in the game, I think really speaks to how well that they're recruiting there. Now, we did over from the Rumble Seat, we had a couple of conversations this past week where a couple of Clemson fans dropped in. They were talking about kind of the only thing maybe keeping them from going to the next level. It seems like there's some frustrations maybe with some lower end commitments that they're taking due to family commitments and ties. Not so much because they're particularly worthy players, but because Dabo played with one of their dad or something like this, to where a couple of those things are happening. So just something to keep an eye on in future years as we keep watching Clemson try to build and maintain the success that they've got. One of the things I said I was watching too last week was how Mark Richt finished out his first class in Miami. Like we said, it's only been a couple months that he's been down there, and so what was he able to salvage and then pull together? Thought they did a fairly good job. I know from my perspective, they took a commit from Georgia Tech last night. It's not that he was committed anywhere, but it came down to Georgia Tech in Miami. That was with 4-star safety Romeo Finley, and he ended up with Miami, where he was kind of a childhood fan, but really wasn't something where Miami was in the game early on. He kind of took a last-minute visit down there, and apparently it sold him enough to where he ended up down there. So a nice job for Mark Richt finishing out his first recruiting class at Miami. At the moment, Rivals has them at #21, so right outside the top 20, but certainly another good class. And then the only other one that I'll mention, being my other fanhood beyond Georgia Tech, is Louisville. I think there was a little bit of turbulence here down the stretch where they had some local players and some longtime commits that kind of were flipped to go to elsewhere. I know one of them, the defensive back, ended up at Ohio State. Balin Buchanan, who was son of Ray Buchanan, another guy that Georgia Tech was actually interested in, he decommitted back in December, and then shortly afterwards ended up at Tennessee. But that said, they also brought in a couple of good guys here towards the end. So kind of a nice job to save face here at the end for Bobby Petrino, but certainly could have been a little better if they were to hold on to recruits from throughout the process a little better.
Yeah, Louisville bunched up at 36, 37, and 38 according to ESPN 24/7 and Rivals. You mentioned that Florida State class at #1 as it currently stands according to ESPN, #2 for Rivals and 24/7. What's impressive about this Florida State class? 19 4- and 5-star athletes out of 25 commits, and they really were bolstered and made that jump 4 or 5 spots in the rankings today based on 3 guys on the fence that went their way. The 11th ranked offensive tackle in the nation, Jawan Williams, chose Florida State earlier today. Also the 10th rated defensive tackle, Shavar Manuel, did a flip from Florida to Florida State, and also a huge commit in Landon Dickerson, the 5th rated offensive tackle who was considering Alabama, Tennessee. He had the helmets lined up this morning. He went with Florida State. So Jimbo Fisher, a closer on this day, on National Signing Day, to possibly bring in the best haul in the nation. Mike, your thoughts about the cream of the crop and just whatever else caught your eye?
Yeah, so I think with Florida State, the one big surprise was, well, I mean, not a huge surprise, but the one surprise I saw, obviously, Jawan Williams, like you just mentioned, but the fact that they were able to flip Shavar Manuel and also gain a commitment from Keith Gavin a couple nights ago, 6'3" wide receiver, target out Crawfordville, Florida. That was huge for them because, Gavin had committed to Florida State last year, and then it was to a point in time where he decided to reopen his commitment, and he was being recruited highly, and Alabama was real hot on the trail for him, and he ends up sticking originally to his commitment with Florida State, which was huge. He was instrumental from all indications in recruiting some other guys to stay with Florida State, even though, some of these guys, and in Florida State's case, most of the guys in their class, are ranked so highly and thought of so highly by many schools across the country that, they're in a situation where they're being recruited by many coaches and many teams that are just as good as Florida State. So for Florida State to keep Keith Gavin on board and also signed defensive end Brian Burns this afternoon. That was huge for them. 6'5", 217-pound defensive end. He'll provide a good depth option for them initially, and he's a guy that'll step in the next couple seasons in a starting role and really produce for them. But it's ho hum for Florida State with Jimbo Fisher. I mean, I feel like at this point he's batting about 1,000. They've been the #1 class in the ACC every year since he took over as head coach in 2010, and they've had a top class since he's been on the staff. In the late 2000s. So when you look at their successes they've had, it's not a huge surprise they were #1 class in the ACC. But I think to make that jump and get the guys that they got today, they were kind of on the fence about coming to Florida State. Says a lot about Jimbo Fisher and his ability with his staff for them to close on some of these recruits that were so highly thought of. And Florida State, for them to rival Alabama as one of the top classes in the nation, says a lot about where this program is heading. As for Clemson, Joey said a lot about them, but getting Trey Lamar, Dexter Lawrence, and Rashawn Smith is a cornerstone of your recruiting class. I mean, you get three five-star defensive players according to Rivals, and they made a real run at Rashawn Gary last weekend, and by all indications, it was a very close decision there for Gary, the #1 defensive tackle and #1 overall player by nearly every recruiting service you looked at. He ended up sticking with his original commitment with Michigan. I guess he hadn't necessarily chosen Michigan up until today, but he was a guy that was heavily interested in the Wolverines, and Jim Harbaugh did a great job recruiting him. And by all indications, up until this past week, it looked like Michigan was a shoo-in, that he was going to end up there come National Signing Day, and he eventually did. But Dabo Swinney and his staff made a huge run at him last weekend on his official visit there to Clemson. So it just says a lot about Dabo Swinney. And I guess coming off of a national championship appearance, it's not too hard to commit or to recruit to the success of your program. And as far as Miami's concerned, a smaller class by their standards, but to still have a top 25 recruiting class for the first-year head coach, I think is huge, especially considering when Mark Richt came in. It's really only been a month and a half since he took over as head coach, and the big guy they got today was 6'2" wide receiver target Amon Richards out of Wellington, Florida. They were working really hard to keep him in state. He was looking at Florida State as well. University of Georgia was pushing hard for him. There were a lot of schools that really wanted his services, and that was kind of the gem of the class that they got today. A big-time player, a real speedster, and a guy that they think can make a difference on the outside immediately there for Miami, and Brad Kaya, who has had guys to throw to here in the past, but Amon Richards will be right up there heading into next season and on down the line. So, I mean, those three schools clearly have separated themselves in the ACC, but I think we'll talk about some schools here in a couple minutes that we're also impressed with, but I think it's far and away, Florida State and Clemson, and then Miami is not far behind, and then there's a little bit of a drop-off, but the ACC is definitely improving on the recruiting trail.
ACC breakdown every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We got Joey Weaver on the line and Mike McDaniel as well. Guys, to give the conference a little context here, 8 teams out of the 14 in the top 40, according to ESPN. I think there's a distinction here, and the kudos to Pitt. Joey touched upon it in the top 30 after like a class rank of, I believe you said, Joey, 65 last year, according to Rivals. Duke has really made strides under David Cutcliffe. He used to coach them up, and now he's got a little bit more talent to coach up, according to this class that ranks anywhere between 28 and 33, according to 3 of the major services. But the distinction that I see in lining up these classes, and this is no great mystery here, is that while Duke and Pitt, Virginia Tech, North Carolina have the type classes we expect, Louisville throw them in there as well, Florida State, Clemson, Miami, they bring in the elite of the elite. Florida State, 16 ESPN 300 players, Clemson 11, Miami 10, and then it plummets after that. Really, the high 4s, the 5s go to those 3 schools this year. Joey, do you think that's a little disconcerting for the entire conference perspective?
I look at it, and first of all, it seems like it's kind of business as usual for those two schools in the Atlantic. I mean, they're the two schools that have basically run the Atlantic Division for the better part of a decade now, both from a talent standpoint as well as from a winning standpoint. I think, I mean, I can't even remember who the last team was from the Atlantic Division other than those two to play in Charlotte. Maybe Boston College under Matt Ryan or something like that. But in any case, I think that it kind of just maintains the balance of power, kind of what you've seen. I mean, those two have been the front runners for the ACC as consistently as anybody else has across the conference for the last several years. The Miami thing, it is another continuation of a trend I think that we've seen where they've typically recruited very, very well. They are in a good area to pull in a lot of talent, a good state, as well as just a good city from a raw talent standpoint. The question is whether Mark Richt can develop talent a little better than both Randy Shannon and Al Golden did. And before, Miami fans, I think there's been a couple of them I've seen that got very excited, like, oh, now we finally got a coach that can develop talent. Well, then again, that's also kind of the thing that got Mark Richt run out of Athens by Georgia fans. So just careful with that one before you go too crazy with it. But again, I think it's about the same. But to see schools like Pittsburgh, like he's mentioned, Duke, Louisville, other guys that are getting into this top 40 and kind of maybe pulling in towards that same talent range, I think it's going to create a lot more parity than maybe we're used to seeing, which is maybe saying something considering we're talking about the ACC here. But at the same time, I don't expect to see a whole bunch of changes regarding who is really kind of the most powerful programs in the conference. I think that obviously sticks with Florida State and Clemson, and kind of what we saw today and over the last few months with this recruiting cycle only just continues to confirm that.